of the main messages in this poem that John Agard tries to convey is the fact that there are two sides to every story, and history tends to only sell one side of the story. And because of that, we never get the whole truth. So what I want to do is just look at briefly some of the stories behind the names and events that come up in this poem so that you have a better understanding of who they are and why they might be relevant. So the 1066 refers to the Battle of Hastings, as you might have known from your history lessons, and it was probably one of the most famous battles in England, and it kind of celebrates the last successful invasion of England. And William the Conqueror was the victor, and that's where we get our kind of Norman ruling class. So it celebrates a significant battle in our history. Now, along with the history, we also get a lot of kind of nursery rhyme and folklore. And Agard does this purposely to show that history, in some ways, is kind of made up. It tells a story. And here we have Dick Whittington and his cats. And this is about a kind of rag to riches story. And it takes place in London. And if you go to London, you can actually see a monument there. So that's how significant this story is. And it's something probably you may have been introduced to as a young child. Again, this idea of education and the fact that we tend to teach a very Eurocentric view. So we teach a lot of the English nursery rhymes and English folklore alongside history. It becomes a part of our identity. And obviously, if you are not British and you're not hearing the history and the tales of where you're from and how Britain and Europe have conquered those places, then you start to lose a sense of your identity because you don't get a voice, because your story is never told. So that's why we have this mixing of the fact and the fiction. Hopefully you can see now that everything's on the other side, and that's to represent this is the other side of history, the black history, if you will, or the non-white, non-Christian history. And we're introduced to the first figure in this black history, which is Toussaint Louverture. Now, Toussaint Louverture was a Haitian general, so that's in the country of Haiti, and he was a leader in the Haitian Revolution. So he fought against the French. So the French had gone into Haiti and taken over, and he fought against them for Haitian independence. So he was someone who was a great leader and a great leader of an army of people, just like some of the other figures that we find out later on in this poem. But you've probably never heard of him, even though he was a significant figure. So again, that's John Agard saying, you know, there are other figures in history. There are lots of different good generals who generals of armies who should be celebrated, but because they're not white and because they're not Christian, you never hear about them. And Toussaint Louverture is the first example in this poem. Now, Jacques Charles is not named in the poem, but it's the man who discovered the balloon, and he was a Frenchman, and he and the Robert brothers launched the first unmanned hydrogen-filled gas balloon in 1783. So the man who discovered the balloon refers to a French scientist. So again, you get that very Eurocentric white view of history. So once again, we are mixing history with nursery rhymes. We have here the hey diddle diddle rhyme that refers to the reference in the poem, the cow jumped over the moon. And this is an English nursery rhyme that dates back a long way to the 16th century. And it goes, hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon, the little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. So that's probably something that you learned as a young child. And again, it's that idea that history and what we teach our children isn't necessarily the most important things. It's just the stuff that we want to tell them. And John Agard, it kind of emphasizes that when he says, them tell me what them want to tell me. And we have this critique of the British education system, only telling students and teaching what they want to teach, what helps to create a strong identity in white British people, and actually robs anybody else of their own sense of identity. So just like Toussaint Louverture, we have another figure, a significant figure from Black history, and probably again someone that you've not heard of before. So she's called Nanny de Maroon, and also known as Nanny of the Maroons, and she was a leader of the Jamaican Maroons. And just like Toussaint Louverture, who led the Haitian Rebellion, Nanny de Maroon creates this kind of force of formerly enslaved Africans who find themselves in the colonies of the West Indies. And she helps them to create this army and fight against the British authorities so that they can be free. So during the years that she helps people to fight back, the British suffer a lot of losses, and people attributed that to Nanny de Maroon having some kind of supernatural powers. And we can see that in the poem when it relates to her as being a sea-far woman. So the idea that she can kind of see the future. So she has somehow these powers, and it's very much linked to nature and natural powers that she gets from the land. So again, a critique of the idea that British people came in and they colonized, and through violence and in slavery, they exploited a lot of countries, particularly in the West Indies. And then they only told their side of the story. They didn't tell the side of the story from the people who suffered at their hands. So now we come back to the Eurocentric history with Lord Nelson, probably a name that you're familiar with, very famous member of the Royal Navy, thought to be very inspirational, and because he was so good at strategy and tactics, the British Navy won several significant victories. He was injured during battle, and eventually when he died in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, he was known as one of the most significant military figures in British history. And if you've ever been to London, if you go to Trafalgar Square, you will see a column, a monument to commemorate his brilliance and his life in the Royal Navy. So a battle that I'm sure you're familiar with, the Battle of Waterloo, 1815. It took place in Belgium, which was part of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands at the time, and it was the French army under the command of Napoleon, who you've probably heard of, and the fact that he was defeated by a British-led coalition under the command of Duke Wellington. So probably another famous British military figure that you are familiar with. And probably equally, another famous military figure, but not white this time, Shaka the Great Zulu. Now you might have heard of Shaka Zulu because there's a very famous film made about him, or you might have covered this in one of your other lessons. But Shaka the Great Zulu was a king and a conqueror, and he lived in Southeast Africa, and he brought together many independent chiefdoms or little groups of people. He brought them all together to create one big strong kingdom. Now whether you agree that that was a good thing or not doesn't change the fact that he had to be a very good strategic thinker. He had to be good at his tactics, and he had to be inspirational in order to do that. So all of the things that we celebrate in our white military leaders, Shaka the Great Zulu must have had all of those qualities, and yet probably most of you don't know about him, or if you have heard about him, you don't know anything about when he existed and what his achievements were. So just another example of how we don't really know about Black history. Another very famous European, this is Christopher Columbus, who's actually Italian, as an explorer, but he explores the Americas under the flag of Spain. Now, some people call him the discoverer of America. That's not strictly true, but what he did do is he paved the way for European colonization of America and the Americas. So he is, to some people, a hero because of the fact that he officially set foot in the Americas in 1492 and was able to subdue and control the population there. And we will find out a little bit more about his effect on the population, the native population, on the next slide. And for some people, he was a real villain because he led to the murder and enslavery of a very, very large number of people. But we only really, from a Eurocentric point of view, we only really know him as being a discoverer and a voyager and an explorer, and all of those good things that we've heard about for Christopher Columbus. And this is the other side of Christopher Columbus, and these are the people that John Agar mentions just after Columbus and 1492. He talks about the Caribs and the Arawaks too. And here we have the Caribs and the Arawaks were two tribes in the Americas. And when Christopher Columbus landed, particularly the Arawaks didn't see them as a threat. They actually gave them gifts and tried to welcome them. Now, the whole point of Columbus's voyage was to find treasure, and he was willing to torture and kill any number of savages, what he called savages, to achieve his goal. And in his log he wrote that they are willing to trade everything they own. They don't bear arms. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. And unfortunately, within 150 years of Christopher Columbus settling there, actually all of the Arawak people were wiped out through either murder, mutilation, suicide. Some of them decided to kill themselves. That would be a better option than having to live as slaves under the conditions, or slavery. So a real devastation to those people, and yet in America, they still celebrate Christopher Columbus Day as being a good thing. So again, that very much that view of the truth and history having two very, very different sides. Florence Nightingale, a very famous figure in English history, known as the founder of modern nursing, and she really became a popular figure during the Crimean War, and she organized for the care of wounded soldiers during that war. She gave nursing a very favorable reputation. She became an icon of Victorian culture, particularly that view of women being very nurturing and caring. And she was known as the lady with the lamp. And we know that that kind of idea of light symbolizes hope and comfort. So she's very much that figure of a female nurturing and comfort and almost self-sacrifice as well. You know, she's a kind of heroic figure of going out to the front line and helping these men by putting herself in danger. And that's very much the story we get of Florence Nightingale. So Robin Hood, I'm sure you've all heard of Robin Hood. He's a kind of legendary outlaw figure, and he has been a part of English folklore since the 1300s, so a very, very old figure in English history. Now, I'm not going to go into it because you probably know all about him as a character, but I think it's really important that you can see that this is an entirely fictional character. Even though we all feel like we know him because his story has lived on and been told and retold and retold, actually, it's just a made-up story. It's part of folklore. And that kind of gets mixed in with the facts or the truth of history. And we kind of see this mixing, again, of fact and fiction. And again, that's Agar trying to point out the view that actually what we're told is true in history isn't always true, and we should question it, and we should be thinking how much of this is true. Whose voice are we hearing? Is there another side that we're not getting? So again, that mixing of fact and fiction highlights that idea of truth in history. As does this reference to Old King Cole. And again, another nursery rhyme. Around about the 1700s, it comes in to the English nursery rhymes. It's unlikely that this is based on any historical figure, so another example of fact mixing with fiction. And if you've never heard the rhyme before, it says, Old King Cole was a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was he. He called for his pipe, and he called for his bowl, and he called for his fiddlers three. Every fiddler he had a fiddle, and every fine fiddle had he. Oh, there's none so rare as can compare with King Cole and his fiddlers three. So again, probably something that you've heard of, maybe just the first part. The second part is not as popular, but you've probably heard of Old King Cole, and again, that view of history mixing with fiction. A figure that you're unlikely to have heard of is Mary Seacole. So Mary Seacole, another prominent black figure in history that probably none of you have heard of. She was a British Jamaican nurse, and actually, just like Florence Nightingale, she was a healer and a nurse in the Crimean War, and she set up what was known as the British Hotel behind the enemy lines. And she described this as a place where people could go if they were sick or wounded or just in need of comfort. And she provided assistance for wounded servicemen on the battlefield. So just as important as Florence Nightingale, only you never really hear about her voice. You never hear about her story. Even though Florence Nightingale is such an iconic and famous figure, because she's white, we have Mary Seacole, who's black, who did just as good a work in the Crimean War, but you've probably never heard of her. So in 2004, she was actually voted the greatest Black Briton. So, you know, a really prominent figure that has not really been given the recognition that she deserves, maybe because she's black and not white. So just to summarize really quickly, Agard wants his readers to know that history is only one version of events. There is always another side. And in England, we have a very Eurocentric view of history. Most of the figures and events that feature in our history are white Christian figures, and black figures in our history aren't given the same recognition. And Agard wants us to question why this is. He also wants to give a voice to those figures in history who have been forgotten or ignored, because he thinks that that has a massive impact on his own sense of identity. Agard deliberately mixes fact and fiction to emphasize the view that history is only based on what happened. So how it is retold and taught can be embellished or exaggerated to make one side look better than another. History always serves a purpose. It will always have an agenda. So Agard just wants us to think about history the way it's taught, and to think about and consider what is written in history, what side is it telling, and what about the other side? That's the really important question. What about the other side of history that has been forgotten and silenced?